So a lot of you have probably heard by now that a new AI model has come out of China called Deepseek. And this, within the span of a day, caused a massive market correction in the United States, where companies like NVIDIA lost billions of dollars of value. OpenAI and other AI companies have also suffered a lot. And the reason for this is because what the Deepseek model essentially did was the same thing or comparable to what a lot of models in the US or other models in China do, very expensive, very energy inefficient models, but for a fraction of the price. And so what this does, not only does it put on the market a competitor for these AI programs that is now much cheaper, which always changes the game, but it also has made clear that the amount of capital and energy that the AI moguls in America have been insisting to us is necessary in order to keep up with the future was essentially a lie and a grift. And they might not have even known that. I think a lot of these guys have drank their own Kool-Aid, and they're so obsessed with this vision of sort of like AI world domination that they didn't really allow themselves to consider that their methods of building these programs might be needlessly wasteful. There might be cheaper ways of doing it, or also just that the profit-seeking motive trying to make these models to draw profit is counterproductive. And I think a lesson we can learn from this is that AI may be a useful technology in some ways, but the reason it is so vampiric in its application in the United States is because, just like everything in the United States, it is folded into the idea of making a profit. And so you have these privately owned businesses that are owned by shareholders and run by people who have a responsibility to those shareholders to create enormous amounts of profit. These are huge companies that are asking for billions of dollars at a time. And so they have to create profits from these machines that justify those investments that they are continually asking for. And in some cases, they've been able to do that. In some cases, it's dubious whether they've been able to do that. In some cases, they have not been able to do it at all. But either way, the kind of train keeps moving. And now, especially with Donald Trump being elected and being friendly with these AI companies, it seems that even though it is not profitable as they exist now for these AI companies to be sort of cannibalizing all of the data in the country, they are going to continue not just operating, but operating in that way, eating an enormous amount of capital, eating an enormous amount of data for not very much return. And so now that this new model hits the market, Deepseek, it has sent US AI makers and anybody invested in that world into a frenzy and a panic, because not only is this model better than theirs, but it has called into question the entire basis of their organizations. This is a house of cards built on, shameless grifting, absolute wastes of money and resources and energy, as well as enormous amounts of theft of data and questionable use of unquestionably copyright protected materials. And so now what OpenAI is saying is that in order to create the Deepseek model, these developers stole their intellectual property. In other words, stole their coding. They're saying the Deepseek model does the same thing as OpenAI models. It's programmed the same way. And they're saying that that is intellectual property theft. So this is obviously hilarious on the face of it, because all of these models are built off of intellectual property theft. None of them exist without theft of intellectual property. Let's get that 100% clear. That's also true for Deepseek. But it's definitely true for these American companies that have created these unprofitable models. They keep promising us that these are not only going to be profitable, but world-changing technologies. And yet all it seems to have done is devalued a lot of intellectual property that it was supposed to be a good thing for it to be freely available on the internet. Turns out that just made it freely available for it to be sucked up and turned into slop by some of the most shameless grifters in the country. And now those same shameless grifters are claiming that their intellectual property was stolen. And so this is a weak defense. I think the main reason they're making that defense is because they want the United States government, as ran by Donald Trump, to be positioned behind them and against China. They're trying to make this an issue of China. Same thing that they did with TikTok. That because TikTok is a Chinese company, that means that this is not about competition between American companies and Chinese companies. It is about competition between American companies and the Chinese government at large. So that is the utility of claiming that they're stealing intellectual property. It's not saying, oh, this isn't fair. Stealing intellectual property is bad. They can't quite make that claim, can they? But they can make the claim that China is threatening national security because of the fact that they are plagiarizing U.S. companies. And so that very well might pass muster with the people in the State Department and other departments in the government that would be able to push the narrative that China, through all of these means, whether it's TikTok or Deepseek, is mounting some kind of offense against America. And so not only is that dangerous because we seem to continually be pushing ourselves closer and closer to wanting to go to war with China, even though there, in my opinion, nothing that China has done amounts to an actual offensive action of any kind. If anything, and Noam Chomsky has pointed this out before, what you have between these two countries is this continual defensive posturing that the other side perceives as offensive posturing. And so ad nauseum, you have these repeated defensive or offensive gestures that essentially escalate into some kind of war conflict. So we're seeing all of these Chinese companies, whether they're TikTok or Deepseek or whatever else, be sort of used as leverage to that end. That any leverage Chinese companies have over American companies is in effect an act of war and needs to be treated as such. So not only is that dangerous, but it also is a way for these AI guys to not see what is right in front of them, which is that China created a better model because, or I should say, a Chinese company created a better model because they are not focused on the same thing that American AI companies are focused on. American AI companies are focused on creating the largest, most upward scalable, and most supposedly profitable models that they can. And because this is not a very profitable technology in general, even in its smallest or largest form, it's simply not that profitable. So what they need to do is they need to inflate the amount of investment as much as they possibly can to try to create the impression on the back end that there is some profiting happening there. And to put it simply, this is why a Chinese company is able to outcompete us in such humiliating fashion. This is not just an example of them making a model that's like better in some way than American models. This is them making a model that is comparable, if not better, to US models for a fraction of the price. It shows that they have been overcharging for everything, from software to hardware to personnel. Everything is overvalued. And so that's why you saw this market correction when it comes to AI because of this. Because by creating one model, they showed that we are doing things so mind-blowingly inefficiently that we're actually way, way further behind than we thought. And what a lot of people picture when they picture China or Chinese companies, especially these AI evangelist types, is some kind of giant monolithic, the Chinese Communist Party is creating these technologies as a direct affront to the United States to steal all of our data and learn things about us so that they can one day, eventually in the future, do warfare against us. And because China is supposedly a communist party, that means that every single thing China does is part of the monolith of government. And there's some truth to that, because the way China is organized is such that even though there is still capitalism there, there's a lot of capitalism there, and there are many people there who are rich, entrepreneurs, there are billionaires there, and there are people there who do the same things that we do here. They create AI models, they create cryptocurrencies, all that stuff. So all of the benefits and foibles of capitalism that we see accentuated in America, you actually see the same things in China, except it's regulated much more efficiently. So you see a more efficient version of capitalism from China. And the reason why is because the entire society, the entire government is not built around the worship of the profit motive. And instead, at least theoretically, it's built around the idea that everything that capital does is for the greater good of the people. And if something that a capitalist is doing or has ownership of is in some way against the interests of the Chinese people at large, or useful to the Chinese people in a way that is not being used for, the Chinese government reserves the right to essentially step in and take ownership of that capital at any given time. So that is the difference between the Chinese government and the American government. In the American government, you have more of this sense that your private property, your private businesses and capital is sacred, and only in the most explicitly sanctioned conditions can the U.S. government step in. And that almost never happens, that the U.S. government nationalizes or takes control of some kind of private resources. In fact, over the last 50 years or so, we've seen the exact opposite. We've seen more and more publicly owned services and things that people need privatized, because that's essentially the promise of neoliberalism, that by attaching a profit motive to something that the government is supposed to do, you get the most efficient way of solving that problem. Because capitalists, in order to make a profit, are going to find the most efficient solution to the problem that is being solved. The problem with that is that not every problem that needs to be solved is profitable. And so, first of all, that leaves a bunch of things on the table, a bunch of things that need to be dealt with that cannot be dealt with by privatization. But it also makes it so that the things that you do privatize as a way to try to solve those problems efficiently, you're doing it in a way that you're putting that in the hands of people who are literally trained to disregard what are called externalities in favor of making themselves a profit. And that's the opposite of the way government is supposed to work. People look at something like the United States Postal Service and say, oh, this is losing so much money, it's wasting so much money. No, it's not. It costs money. It's a service that costs money. It's not a business that profits. It's a service that is supposed to serve as many people as possible, and that does cost money. And guess what? We have the money for it. We're the richest nation in the world, so we should have the most robust services in the world. And China, the reason they are outcompeting us in many ways, the reason why the US perceives China as a threat, is not because of TikTok or Deepseek or, sneaky data thieves who are taking all of our information and giving it to the Chinese Communist Party. It's because China has created a more efficient method of growth than us. And you could argue that they've created a more efficient way of serving their people. Some people make that case. There's plenty of things to criticize and point to about China as authoritarian. They definitely have an authoritarian organization of their government, and the way they surveil and suppress dissent amongst their citizens it's what totalitarian dictatorships do. And so in my mind, there's no question that China is that. But there's also no question that when it comes to capitalism, China is doing what we do much better, much more efficiently, and in a way that actually serves its people better. So despite the fact that the Chinese government is a repressive regime, they also know that if you're going to have capitalists making as much money as they can and reveling in all of these technologies that are supposed to be world-changing, at a certain point, the government has to step in and say, if you're not doing this for the greater good of the country, then you are no longer allowed to operate. And so the evidence is in terms of which of these motive models works better. Because as we are rushing to dump as much money into AI as we can to maybe hopefully create something that is profitable, and then as a side effect, maybe it'll have some utility for humanity, companies in China are able to sort of offhand, as almost a pet project, create a model that outcompetes all of the leading models in America, because they just have a different set of incentives. And so that different set of incentives causes them to allocate their resources and their time differently, and actually leads to a better overall benefit for their country. And so America, the main problem that we have is we have to figure out not how to compete with TikTok and Deepseek. We have to figure out how to compete with collectivism, essentially. And if America wants to continue being this individualistic nation, we've got to recognize that that's put us in a position where we are not only less efficient, but less profitable. And this technology that we were trying to take the lead in has now become one of the greatest sinkholes of our entire economy. And this bubble is becoming big enough, especially if it starts to infiltrate different sectors of the economy. It could lead to some kind of massive crash just because of how inefficient it is. And that could have enormous implications. So it's unfortunate that our nation is not able to look at what China's doing and say, we need to restructure our incentives so that we can create more efficient technology more quickly, but rather we view it as an act of aggression. And so our response is probably going to be acts of aggression, especially with Donald Trump in power. And ultimately, I think that's really just going to give China even more of the upper hand in this situation, because they are outmaneuvering us, and then our only response is to lash out. And so that just puts them more in the advantage position in terms of how they respond to that. So this folds into a larger thought process that I'm starting to have about the fact that America needs a general strike in order to take power back, not only from the overreaches of government, but from some of these oligarchic tech companies that are stealing our intellectual property. They're stealing our personal data, our personal information, and they're sucking it all up and using it all for their own purposes and not giving us a dime of any of it. That's a reflection of a larger problem in America, which is all of our wealth and all of our value being transferred upward. And that's what the first Trump administration represented, and that's what the second Trump administration is going to represent as well. So in my last video, I talked about the fact that there is now some evidence that 3.5 million voters that would almost certainly have gone towards Kamala Harris and voted for Kamala Harris were discounted. And in many cases, these were votes that were cast and then thrown out. And then in other cases, these were people that were thrown off of the voter rolls, forced to sign provisional ballots, which then in consequence might not have been counted. And there's data behind this, there's numbers behind this. I'm not going to go into it again in this video, but I am going to continue talking about it because I think this is grounds for a general strike. This is voter suppression, which is a pattern that's been happening in this country for at least 100 years, really much more than that. And it is escalated to a point where a very unpopular president was elected essentially through the disenfranchisement of millions of mostly black voters and almost all Democratic-leaning voters. And so that's how we find ourselves in this position that we're at now. And it's not an election conspiracy. It's just numbers. You look at the numbers of how many votes, how many mail-in votes by percentage are usually thrown out in elections, and then you create a conservative estimate of this election and the amount of mail-in votes and the amount that were likely thrown out based on that, and different versions of that for the different forms of voting. And this journalist, Greg Palast, has landed on the figure of 3.56 million voters disenfranchised. He essentially asserts that Donald Trump would have lost the election if all of the votes were counted. So I think it's time for us to start talking about a general strike. But I think for obvious reasons, the American public, I don't think, is likely to immediately react to claims of election malfeasance. We already had this whole fiasco with the 2020 election. People are jaded. People don't know what to think of that. There's many people out there who think Trump might be right, even though he's not. There's not an ounce of evidence for anything that he said in terms of voter fraud. But then now for the other side to start coming and saying that they were cheated out of an election, a lot of people probably aren't going to buy that up front. And so in order for a general strike or any type of large social upheaval to happen, there needs to be some kind of flashpoint, something that happens that affects the maximum amount of people so that the maximum amount of people can get on board with some kind of radical action. And we saw this in 2020 because not only was the murder of George Floyd horrific and on camera for all of us to see and very emotionally stirring, but that was also during COVID when a lot of people didn't have jobs, a lot of people didn't have anything to do, and the future of the country was very uncertain. And so those are the conditions where people do things like take to the streets and start protesting and start various forms of civil disobedience. So as these crises with AI tech start to happen, other crises related to Donald Trump trying to freeze all spending of the federal government, or there was a Black Hawk, a military helicopter that just crashed into a civilian airliner in Washington, D.C. This just happened today. And some people are speculating that that's because people that were fired from the FAA, etc., people that Donald Trump fired from the FAA. So long story short, Donald Trump's policies, very straightforwardly, are in many cases going to create the conditions for destitution, if not outright collapse, of the economy at large or different parts of the economy. The recklessness through which Donald Trump and his cohort wants to dismantle the government is going to lead to different types of crises that they probably themselves cannot even fathom or are not prepared for. And so a self-created crisis by Donald Trump, whether it's related to AI or China or just some draconian policy of the Donald Trump administration that leads to backlash, whatever it may be, the conditions are going to become apparent in this country for radical action and civil disobedience. People are going to continue being stripped of rights, and just general disastrous things are going to happen. And so we need to seize on those moments, and we need to try to use that to point towards the idea of a general strike, because a general strike is the only way that we're going to be able to take any leverage back from the government as it currently exists. Labor is the only way to do it. The institutions are not going to save us. The courts are not going to save us. Congress is not going to save us. It has to be labor. And so I think all of these issues come back to that. AI tech comes back to that. AI tech is a theft of labor, it's a theft of intellectual property, and it's a theft of people's livelihoods. And so we need to watch AI closely, because these different fluctuations that happen and supposed disruptions that they try to create in the economy are going to lead certain people to conditions where they're going to be ready to hit the streets and demand some kind of change. And we need to, for lack of a better word, capitalize on that energy when it emerges.